Hey everyone, I'm Amethescence, and I tormented myself for 7 days. That's right, I'm talking about my participation in the 2025.2 Brackeys Game Jam. If you've been watching my channel for a bit, I'm sure you already know what a game jam is, as I have made several videos on it beforehand. But in case you didn't know, a game jam is a timed competition where you or a small group of people make a game. And because I'm apparently utterly insane, not only did I take on this week-long challenge by myself, but I also decided to make something quite difficult, at least for my skill level. And that's a combat system. Although mine was somewhat rudimentary and simple, it was still a major challenge that took a whole lot of time and effort, especially since I consider myself to be a beginner programmer. So why exactly did I choose to include something that would be so difficult for me? Well, this particular game jam just so happened to occur sometime around one of my brother's birthdays. And just like last time, I wanted to make a game according to his preferences. It just turns out his preferences lean more towards mechanics rather than story. These were the parameters that he gave me. It has to be a strategy game, but not a puzzle game. Have different ways to do one thing, have a sci-fi or fantasy vibe, an edgy male protagonist, and a dark, complicated story that makes you think. Looking back, I don't think I hit every mark as much as I would have liked to, but he still ended up liking it at least a little, which I consider to be a win. And since I had the parameters, I could start working on the game. Before the jam even started, and before I knew the theme, I started preparing for it. I knew that this game jam was going to be my biggest challenge yet. I also knew that I wouldn't have as much time as I would like due to various obstacles and events that just so happened to land within the time frame of the jam. Before all of this, it had been quite a bit of time since I last worked in Godot, my game engine of choice. So I did some small projects, mostly based around coding, to remind myself how to code in GTscript. 2 days before the jam, I started to make a basic framework for the game I would make. I already had a vague idea for what the protagonist would look like, so I started making an inspiration board for him in a very basic sketch. Then I made a framework for an interactable, which I didn't end up using too much, and a real-time combat system, which I ended up scrapping. Basically, that prep didn't really do too much for me. Day 1. On day 1, I woke up and immediately checked the theme. It was Risk It for the Biscuit. As I was working throughout the day, I kept thinking over and over again about the combat system I had made. As much as I really hated the idea of throwing away my hard work, I knew that a turn-based combat game would work far better for a strategy game. So that's when I chose to scrap my original combat system. And that decision ended up being the bane of my existence. But anyway, I started out with coming up with a premise and a plot. After all, if you know me, you know I love to include a story. And this is usually one part of the game design process that I really dislike because it usually takes forever. But I seem to be getting better at it, as I was able to figure everything out in probably 1 or 2 hours. If you want to learn what that plot is, you're just going to have to play it. Then I designed the player character. My brother wanted him to look cool and edgy, so I tried my absolute best. I think character design is one of my strong suits, so this part wasn't necessarily hard. After I finished this design and got the okay from my brother, I moved on to the hardest and most important part of the game design process, the combat system. I don't know how many of you are programmers or game designers, but I'll try to explain the process of making the system in a way that's easier to understand. I started out looking for tutorials for turn-based combat and didn't find any. I mean, they were there, but they were all from quite a few years ago and from different versions of Godot. So I had to kind of figure it out myself. No pressure at all. So yeah, this was a very interesting challenge for me. But by the end of the first day, I was able to get a basic framework down. This supported a player that you control, a singular enemy that just attacks, basic UI, and graphics. And I gave the player the ability to choose between a weak attack and a strong attack, the latter resulting in some damage dealt to yourself. This choice would hopefully add a risk factor. You can choose to do a weaker attack and save some extra health, or deal a strong attack and take some of your own health. I was very proud that I was able to put this together in less than a day. Day 2. On day 2, the biggest thing I did was the combat. I gave the player the ability to move to different positions: left, middle, and right. Then I started on the really hard stuff. The combat I had so far was fine, but it needed more. I wanted it to be easily scalable to add in multiple enemies. The framework code for the combat system was all in one place. But in order to control how many enemies and what kind of enemies are in each battle, I had to create a separate script and system for each unique enemy. Making the code for each enemy wasn't necessarily hard because I only had 2 basic enemies, and because I had already done most of the hard work in my base script. I did, however, add more moves that the enemies can perform. In a lot of turn-based games, enemies will display some kind of animation or indicator before they do an attack, or at least a large attack. So that's what I added. I coded a system where each enemy has a list of possible attacks. Every enemy turn where the enemy isn't actively engaging in prepping or attacking, they randomly choose from a list of attacks. Then, in their upcoming turns, they show different animations to show what kind of attack the enemy will use. The likelihood of what attack is picked is dependent on how many times I put that attack in their list of attacks. For example, if that list includes a weak attack and 2 strong attacks, the enemy is twice as likely to randomly choose a strong attack. Here's the code for one of the enemies, but it's probably better to show the actual battle. All these graphics were changed later on, but this is the general gist of it. Notice how the enemy has these attack animations that don't do any damage to the player, and then it attacks. Another thing I needed to add regarding the combat was the trigger, and to do that I decided to reuse the code I made for the real-time combat system from just before the jam. I only used the code that allows the enemy to detect and follow the player. Then I added in code that would trigger the battle when this overworld enemy got close enough. And this is where things got really complicated for me. The next thing I needed to do to make the combat system more scalable was add in the ability to dynamically add enemies to every battle sequence. In order for me to do that without creating a million different scripts, I have to be able to automatically instance the enemy scene and script into each battle. All those technical words basically mean adding an enemy into the battle. Up to 3 enemies can be in each battle, and each enemy needs to be told what position to be in and what kind of enemy it is. So I needed to add a way to dynamically tell each battle scene all that information. And I was able to do it after research and such, but I had a whole lot of problems during the process. There was the issue where I could add the enemies, but they either wouldn't do anything on their turn, or they would, but their attacks wouldn't deal any damage. Or they would attack and do double damage. And for a while, certain moves just made the screen turn gray. Not sure why. I was able to fix all the issues but one, and I just couldn't figure out how to fix that one. And even though I really wanted to finish the combat system that day, I wasn't able to. Regarding the art aspect, I mostly just made the walking animations for the player and started on the designs for the 2 other major characters. Day 3. On day 3, I expected to spend the entire day trying to fix the bug, but I actually figured it out really quickly. I would tell you how, but I didn't write it down in my notes, so you're just going to have to trust me. Here's the end result. I basically drag in the overworld enemy and go to this area over here. Up here specifically, where I can edit my custom-made parameters, I can put in all the information it needs to spawn in the enemies. This uses arrays and dictionaries, something I'm not too confident in, so I can't really explain it much either, but this is the code. I don't really think this is the best solution I could have gone with, but it was the best I had. The rest of the day was mostly spent on the visual aspects of the game. First, I made the tile set. If you don't know what that is, pixel art games are usually made up of square tiles. Of course, you can just draw the entire thing from scratch, but another way to do it is to create one of each kind of tile into one image, upload it, and set it up in your game engine. And then you can just choose a tile and draw with it like so. So with that, I started designing the map of the place. I really wanted this neon bluish color scheme because that just feels very sci-fi to me. I had this idea of these islands floating in a blue void, kind of similar to my last game jam, but more sci-fi. Next, I did a whole lot of work regarding the characters. With the main character, who I named Kyrion, I animated his attack animations and then implemented both that and his walking animation into the game. I then finished the designs for these two characters and made a few more animations for different things. I named this character Vyra, which I didn't exactly love. I didn't really love her design either. This is actually the second version of it, which I still don't love, but it's better than the previous version. And then I made the intro cutscene. That's all I'm going to show, but you get the gist. And finally, I tried for an unnecessarily long and frustrating amount of time trying to fix the blurry UI problem I was having with the dialogue sections. I'm using the Dialogic add-on. If anyone knows how to fix the quality issue, please let me know. I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the resolution of my game and how it scales upward to fit the player screen. But surely there has to be a fix other than just making the resolution of the game bigger, since the rest of the game looks fine. The pixelation and blurriness really annoys me, and I never ended up getting it fixed. Day 4. On day 4, my Wi-Fi stopped working. Yep, it stopped working. Which is terrible for a major reason. My entire mood board, plan for the game, plot, and layout was only accessible through Milanote. Milanote is a note app that I use, and I think it's pretty great in all aspects. All aspects other than the fact that it doesn't work without the internet for some reason. And, of course, without the internet, I wasn't able to upload any art from my iPad to my game to be used. Anyway, I was definitely totally okay with this, and it totally didn't multiply my stress by 10. I just decided to work on the art that I still remembered needed to be done. This includes the expressions for Vyra and Kyrion, attack animations for a recurring character I'm just going to call the figure, designed and animated the enemies, drew the sprite for the boss, and created this sprite for the third character I named Serena. At some point, the Wi-Fi started working again, which I was very happy about. And once it was, I immediately got back to work with all the computer-related things. I implemented both the enemies I designed, which was fairly easy since I had already done all the hard work with making the enemies. I basically just had to replace the temporary visuals and animations with the ones I made. I filled out more of the map, added more battle sequences, and tried to figure out how to get the enemy navigation to work. I kept getting this generation error with it and spent a really long time trying to fix it, which I eventually did. Apparently, it had to do with the collision shapes of certain things on the map. And finally, I started working on one of the main aspects of the gameplay, and those are the abilities. Part of my plan for this game was the ability to choose either to fight the main boss right away, or go to 1 to 3 different areas to get up to 3 different abilities. So that's what I was starting to work on, specifically the bottom section. And so I designed it, added in enemies, and implemented a cutscene that plays as soon as you enter. Then I created the ability to leave and come back, which sounds simple on the surface, but it isn't. This is mostly because every time you enter into a section, you reload a pre-made scene. It doesn't automatically remember if you, as the player, killed the enemies in there or completed a task. So I had to somehow get the game to remember what the player had and hadn't done, and update that area accordingly each time it was loaded. And there comes a time in every game jam that I participate in where my motivation starts to dwindle a bit, where I don't care as much about the code being pretty and perfect. And this is where that started to show. So yeah, I was getting a bit tired, but still I pushed onward. Day 5. On day 5, I finished the bottom section. This includes a mini-boss where I had to adjust some things from the base enemy AI, as well as adding in the ability for that section and making sure it's only given to the player under certain conditions. Then I added another key feature, and that's universal health. Basically, a part of the strategy is that you, as the player, have to manage your health throughout the game. So I made additional UI to appear on the screen whenever the player isn't actively engaging in battle, and made the player health into a global variable, which just means it can be accessed across all scripts and scenes and doesn't reset unless I specifically tell it to. I also made some animations for the final boss, but most of the rest of the day was spent on the left section. This mostly just includes a lot of the same things I did for the bottom section. That's designing the map, adding in enemies, making the intro cutscene, allowing the game to remember what you've done in that area when you leave and come back, creating the ability for that section, etc., etc. And then, since this trial was obviously going to be different from the other two, there were some additions as well. For one thing, I edited the script for this enemy that follows the player around. It was a simple edit. I just made it so I can dynamically change the area in which it triggers the battle. A not-so-simple script change I made was the ability to detect if a battle had just ended. This was necessary because winning each subsequent battle in this section should trigger a line of dialogue and a decision the player has to make. And this was so annoying. An absolute nightmare. After each battle, a question is asked, and then an animation plays. But for some reason, the animation wasn't working properly, and it took forever to figure out why. All I have in my notes is that it took absolutely forever, and that I don't really remember anything. It was a major pain in the butt. But the most important thing is that I got it done. Day 6. On day 6, I finished the third and final ability area, the right area. This includes all the basic stuff that the other two had, as well as the additional mechanics specific to that area. The first is the health slowly draining, creating a sense of urgency for the player to get to the end. The second was spikes. The spikes part was easy, the health part not so much. I had some issues with the right area as well, as to be expected, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the day before. Afterward, I made a few tiny visual changes while I was away from my computer. This includes adding a shadow under most sprites that I thought needed it, and making slightly different versions of this figure sprite. I also adjusted some colors of the tileset to make things easier to see, and created a battle screen background to replace the plain white one I had before. And finally, since I knew I'd be pressed for time on the last day, I started working on the final section. Not an ability section, but the final boss. Day 7. Day 7 was understandably stressful. Usually I want to be mostly done the day before the submission so that I have time to playtest and add little bells and whistles. Obviously, that would not be the case this time. I immediately got to work, trying to finish the boss battle section. I started out with the entrance animation and the dialogue, as the latter would heavily depend on choices made throughout the game and result in different endings. Then I made the boss AI and animations. Afterward, I finished all the dialogue and code that checks certain conditions so it can trigger different endings. There was this additional issue I ran into regarding ending the boss fights versus ending the normal fights. I wanted something specific to trigger when the player defeats a boss, and there was an issue with that I needed to figure out. I had to fiddle around with it, but I was eventually able to create an override. Then I went through all the things that really aren't necessary for the game to be good, but I would not let my game be published without them. So I added Y sorting, which basically tells the game whether certain sprites should appear above or below another sprite. I also added voices. I'm not sure if that's the right thing to call them, but they sound like this. Then I made and added in a title screen and a loading screen. And finally, I tested. This took me hours, simply because of the sheer amount of different things the player can or cannot do. I had to test all these possibilities. I tested and fixed bugs for several hours and very late into the night. I didn't bother to write any of them down because of how little time I had to get my game done. And so I just kept going and going until I was finally okay with it, even though I was pretty sure there were still more errors. But anyway, I exported the game, made the itch.io page, and published it about 3.5 hours before the deadline, at around 3 a.m. That's the closest I've ever gotten to pulling an all-nighter. I hope I won't have to do that again. And that's pretty much all. I fixed a few errors a day or two after the deadline, but that was still within the 48-hour grace period. More errors were found after that 48 period time, but I couldn't fix them as per the rules. Reflection. This game was maybe a bit too difficult for me. It really took a lot out of me, and I was utterly drained by the end of it. I wouldn't necessarily say that I bit off more than I could chew. More like I took a gigantic bite, the kind that you have to chew for a very long time to break it down enough so you can swallow little by little. And by the end of it, your jaw is very sore. It was like that. I didn't even really like thinking about the game after it was finished. At the time that I'm writing this, that opinion has changed, however. This was way more difficult than any of my other Game Jam games, but it was a good learning experience and challenge. Would I take on this big of a challenge for a Game Jam again? Probably not. Hopefully not. Knowing me, I probably will, to be honest, because I'm apparently insane and I like to torment myself. But maybe that's a necessary part in the path to becoming a great game developer. As of writing this, the results for the jam have yet to come out. Considering how many games were submitted, I doubt I'll get first place in any of the categories, but that's okay with me. The experience matters more to me than winning, and the Brackeys Game Jam has a wonderful community. The game is called Trials of the Unbroken, and you can find it on itch.io. I'll leave a link in the description for the game if you're interested in playing. It only takes around 10 to 20 minutes to play and can run in your browser. It would mean a lot if you checked it out and let me know what you think. But anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already to see more of my content. Videos like this take a lot of work, so it would be much appreciated. Take care and farewell.